Welcome you this afternoon to a stormwater program that we're going to be presenting. The purpose of our discussion today is to provide an overview of the stormwater situation in Radnor Township and to answer questions from those in the audience. The reason we're considering and focusing on stormwater at this point in time is that I've lived here for over 20 years, and we've conducted a number of engineering studies over that time, but we really haven't taken any kind of concerted action to work out some of the issues that have been identified in them. As a result of that, we've got a backlog of capital projects that need to be addressed. We have no dedicated funding mechanism for stormwater management. It's currently only funded by the taxpayers, by our own taxes, and so that means a number of institutions in the township that contribute to the problems are not paying to correct them. And because we don't have a dedicated funding source, our program is largely reactive. We fix things that break, and that's pretty much what we do. And because of that approach, we spend more money than we would need to if we had a planned program in place. We had another education program about a week ago, and a number of folks attended and spoke out on more of the we're going to focus a lot on the engineering side of stormwater management this afternoon, and focused on the more environmental side, such as planting more trees, retaining it in place, and that kind of thing. And obviously Radnor believes in that. We've spent money to purchase the Levin track, which is over by the Kmart area. We've purchased the Chew track, which is the wooded forest over on the other side of the Blue Route. And obviously, as that kind of land becomes available and we have the money available for it, that certainly will be under consideration. So joining me this afternoon, we have Gene Haggerty, who is an engineer with AMEC, our consultant. And we also have Steve Norsini, who is our director of the Township's Public Works Department. And I'll turn it over to Steve.
I'd like to thank everybody for coming out this afternoon. Let's see. They took our clicker away. There we go. So we've gone through the welcome, and Ms. McCluskey has a very good grasp of really what we're going to be speaking about today. So what are Radnor's stormwater needs? We have a lot of challenging items in the township. We're not different than anybody else. Everybody has these issues in varying amounts. I think one of the great things about Radnor is we're trying to do something about it. So we have aging systems. We have continued development and redevelopment, and that's not a bad thing. Redevelopment and development is what keeps our community fresh and brings in new people. We have impaired streams, and there are state and federal regulations we must follow. And obviously we do have flooding issues in the township. Our resources are decreasing and the backlog is increasing. And there'll be a map later that shows you, but these items are township wide. Here's our map, and I won't get too far in detail. Even up on the big screen, it might be a little tough, but that is a map of the political boundary of Radnor Township. You can see by the various ovals, dots, dashes, that there are stormwater issues that literally affect every portion of the township. So what are we doing now? What are we accomplishing now? With our current resources, we are reactive, and we're going to get into the planning in a little bit. So when there's a problem, we address it, but we're not able to go out and do a lot of testing and analyzing and coming up with game plans that could help take care of future problems. We do minor system repairs. Believe it or not, leaf collection is part of our stormwater maintenance program. The residents might not know that. They're just happy to get their leaves collected every fall, but that is part of our program. We do emergency repairs, street sweeping, and MS4 reporting. So you look at the pie chart, and it shows the 2012 estimated expenditures, the total program cost of about $1.56 million, and the largest single portion of that program is the leaf collection. It's very labor intensive and very equipment intensive. So when you pull that out, there's not a whole huge amount of money spent on the actual stormwater portion. I do want to add one thing. We are reactive in this fact, but we are very proactive when it comes to storms. And when we know that storms are coming, you'll see our crews out in advance trying to clean inlets and get everything prepared as best we can with the existing system. People say to me, what are storm sewers? Well, I'll answer that with they are not sanitary sewers. So they are not the pipes that convey the wastewater from your house, from your dishwasher, your bathtub, and your toilets. We have about 57 miles of storm sewer. Storm sewer carries runoff, rainwater runoff. That's what it's designed to do, to get it off our streets and take it and eventually and pipe it on down. We have 1,500 inlets, plus or minus. Going back to the reactive approach, planning is the key, and part of the program is to do some planning. You need to evaluate what you have to come up with a good program, and in our case, we need to map what we have. We need to know where everything is. Once you do that and you formulate plans and you decide that there's issues or problems you would like to address, you need to design them. And then you can move forward with replacement and repair. This is a very simplistic view of it. There's a lot of different bullets that would be in there, but the planning is huge, and part of the stormwater, the dedicated stormwater fee, what that would fund is planning like this. The township sewer system, a lot of it's 70 years old. In some portions of the township, it's 100 years old. It's made out of terracotta pipe. That's the same pipe, that's the same material that the vases on your back porch is made out of. A lot of the system is made of corrugated metal pipe, which is well over 50 years old. And just a little tidbit, the National Corrugated Metal Pipe Association lists the lifespan for galvanized metal pipe at 50 years. Now, does that mean all our pipe is falling apart right now? No. But it just shows you that a lot of our pipe is at the end of its useful life. Some is in better shape, some is in worse. This one is one of the worst. Excuse me. So that you can see this pipe. You can see the dirt underneath the pipe. So the pipe is deteriorated to the point where you can see the earth beneath it. In reality, what's holding this pipe in place and together is the dirt that surrounds it. And this pipe is in Rosemont, and you can see this is that same galvanized pipe. Today they have different types of galvanized pipe, but this is pretty much the standard for the 60s and 70s. And you can see that line is basically where the big flow line when we have storms. And these are the types of items we should be out mapping and making plans on to replace before it fails. Okay, this is some terracotta storm sewer pipe. You can see the offset joint. That's where the pipes aren't aligned. You can see there's mud and there's a little plant growing in there, and at the end there's a nice deposit of soil. So again, here's a non-functioning pipe, which we addressed, but this is not something that's uncommon. This is what we have. This pipe is actually in Rosemont also. This is in my old neighborhood where I grew up. This is on Marlbridge Road. So there's a culvert that goes under Marlbridge Road for that small stream. If you look at it, this is corrugated metal pipe. It's an arch. And you can see the entire bottom of it is rusted out. This actually connects to a concrete footing. That item in the middle is a tree that has grown through the pipe. And like I say, so this is in Rosemont or Bryn Mawr section. It's down near Ithan Avenue off of Wildhaven at Marlbridge. This is typical. This is not something that is a one-time item. There's other culverts we have that look like this. This is a culvert when our crews were out cleaning inlets they found. This pipe is absolutely useless at this point. It's full. It can't convey any water. We didn't know it was there. This gets back to the mapping. And these are actually in the southern portions of the township. Here's an inlet, one of those 1,500 inlets that we noted on an earlier slide. You can see how much it's deteriorated. The concrete, the cement parging's falling off, the bricks are falling out. We have a lot of inlets like that. We have a list, and our crews go out and they rebuild them. The list could be very, very long, and one of the parts of this program would be to actually determine this list, put this out to bid, and have a contractor come in and do maybe a couple dozen in a year instead of the dozen that we do. Our guys work diligently at it, but there's only so much time allotted for this with our current staffing. When you do that planning, when I said planning is the key, repairs or replacements due to emergencies are reduced. Are they eliminated? No, but they are greatly reduced. And when we use the competitive bidding system as opposed to the emergency response, costs can be reduced by as much as 20%. So there's that much more money to go towards another project. Many people have heard about the MS4 program. It's a federally mandated program that's run by the State Department of Environmental Protection. It is an unfunded mandate, meaning we need to comply, but we get no money for it. It's federally driven water quality protection, and it may sound bureaucratic, but in the end, this program does do a lot of good. There's a lot of value to this program in the fact that it does increase water quality. It requires townships to do some mapping, so there are benefits to it, but there is a cost associated with it. Part of it is inventory and inspections, dry weather monitoring, mapping, and it does protect our water bodies. Effective stormwater management. There's no one single item that you say, boy, what's the best way to do stormwater management? Effective stormwater management involves engineering, it involves science, it involves land use planning, it involves regulation and enforcement and communications, which this is a perfect example of getting the word out to people, using our newsletter, using the website. All of these things combined can provide effective stormwater management. The engineering and the science, I think everybody understands. You know, as engineers, I'm an engineer. When we design a pipe, there's a process we go through to convey that water. Land use planning, that's part of following our subdivision land development ordinance, our zoning ordinance, which controls how many houses can be built on a certain property, what the stormwater management requirements are. It's all part of that. Regulation and enforcement, determining if the systems that were put in are functioning. And that's also part of what we would hope to get funded should that dedicated fee go in. Many homes that were built in recent times, as well as additions to existing older homes, there's a stormwater management component to that permit on your grading permit. And we really need to get out and look and see, do they work? Do these things work? Because it's not always just the big hit that makes a difference. We talk about, in stormwater management, we talk about incremental changes. So you may see a big project, it could be a basin, it could be replacing pipes under the ground, but when we do incremental things, a rain barrel, a rain garden, a seepage bed, by themselves, the effect may be minuscule. But when you multiply it by hundreds of people and thousands of people in a township, the results can be dramatic. So don't always look for the big project, the big hit. There's a lot of things every homeowner can do, and that's part of the communication segment. But I just want everybody to understand, stormwater, there's no silver bullet. There's no valve that we can turn on or off that just takes care of all the problems. There's a multi-pronged approach. It does require resources in the form of funding to do that. With that, I will turn it over to Jean Haggerty.
And good afternoon. My name is Jean Haggerty. I work for a company called AMEC Environment and Infrastructure, and we do environmental consulting around water resources issues primarily. That's what I do, at least. We have the pleasure to work with the town about a year ago. You've heard some of the challenges that are out there. The town decided we had to move ahead with looking at this a little bit deeper, finding out what the community was concerned about. They knew the technical issues. What was the community thinking about stormwater? How do we look at what we need to start investing in managing our stormwater going forward? So our project goals: to assess the stormwater needs in the community, really to look a little bit deeper. You know, we've had Steve and others, doing this bits and pieces with the available time that they had, but taking this information and working with the community, in this case through a Citizens Advisory Committee. So we had a committee that was 20+ local citizens that sat with us and kind of heard a lot about this presentation in a lot more detail over a series of 5 or 6 meetings over 5 or 6 months and talked about these issues. The The idea was to look at what the priorities really were. We heard a lot about flooding mitigation. We heard about water quality protection, regulatory compliance. What were the priorities? What should you be spending your money on? Steve noted that you have over 57 miles of storm pipe in the ground. That's an investment from your community that you've already made that's worth hundreds of millions of dollars over the last 50, 60, 70 years. How do you make sure you're maintaining that? And we heard a lot about the importance of maintenance. The idea is to take those conversations, come back with some ideas about what we should be funding, what level of funding, and what should the commissioners do with that. So our job really is just to bring our findings back to them, and then they will make the difficult decision on how to move this forward. So what specifically would you try to answer? Steve kind of described it a little bit, but what is getting accomplished now? How much are we spending on that? And probably more importantly, what isn't getting done? So if we're doing some reactive maintenance, what could we do if we were getting ahead and doing inspections and getting ahead of the problems? What should those priorities be? What is the level of service the community expects? When there's an issue around flooding, what do you expect your stormwater group to be doing for you? What is the level of public service that should be provided? What is the cost for that? And then how do you distribute those costs? What's the best way to get everybody to kick in? And that's a lot about what we're going to talk about today. So we asked people what a solid program would look like. And again, after some education and outreach, I don't think anybody wants to be overly aggressive. You don't be spending tons of money on this, but you have to find a balance. What's the balance for Radnor? Getting that operation and maintenance done, getting a reasonable amount of maintenance done every year, and starting to take down that backlog you have. There's a preliminary list. It has not been vetted. It's not lots of detail in it, but it says that you have at least $10 million in projects that have been identified that haven't been funded yet. So that backlog of $10 million is an important piece of what we're looking at. And then the regulatory compliance. Your MS4 permit, the federal water quality permit that Steve referenced, those permits are getting more and more important. They're really about protecting water quality. So every community that owns a municipal system is responsible for compliance. And what they're regulating is the discharges from every one of your storm outlets. So there is a discharge permit that says what you can discharge for stormwater. It basically says you can only discharge stormwater. So the emphasis goes on the community to keep things other than stormwater out of the system. So that's part of what Steve has to do through inspections and maintenance and enforcement of your regulations. We ran an exercise with the advisory committee that we call the Stormwater Bucks exercise. We asked everybody if they had $10 and they knew now some of the stormwater issues that were out there, how would they spend that $10? And I'm rounding this up a little bit, and there's some more detail behind it if you want to go to the website and look at the meeting notes. But 40% of the dollars, 39% of the dollars that they spent, they said they'd put it in capital, that you need to start catching up with your capital. But 30%, close to that, on operation and maintenance. So the priorities that came out of this was, probably not unexpected. But you need to have some money set aside for emergencies. We're seeing the intensity of storms increase. How do we start to deal with that? The enforcement and regulatory piece, the water quality challenges, though you're kind of at the beginning of that challenge. Other communities that are in the Chesapeake Bay are a little further ahead. That's going to catch up with you, so you really got to stay making sure you enforce the regulations you have. And then provide some additional tools. And that's more technology we're talking about, asset management systems, being able to track your system, being able to see it more clearly. Right now you rely a lot on spreadsheets and paper information, and you're moving into that direction, but the more tools you have, the more efficient you can be. So after work, and again, I'm taking 6 months worth of information here and giving it to you in 15 minutes, but what is in the recommended plan that came out of the advisory committee discussions? Now these discussions, we would work first with the Township staff, take this information to the advisory committee, tweak it with them, and bring it back with some recommendations. And that taking back the 10-year backlog was really important. And starting to look at the system in a watershed basis, so start doing some watershed studies, because a lot of the background to these issues are what's happening in individual watersheds. If there's more development going upstream in that watershed, you're going to have more problems downstream. How do we start looking at it in a more holistic approach? And then also some equipment replacement under your capital program. If you've been to your public works yard, you need some new equipment. And that's not a big part of the process, but it's an important part to getting your job done. Operation maintenance, really looking at a 10-year system-wide assessment program. Over the next 10 years, we didn't get where we are today in a year or two. And your system's been in place 80, 90, 100 years in some conditions. So over the next 10 years, do an assessment of your program. Every year, get out there and do 10%. See where your issues are. You know your hot spots. Look into the whole system. Make sure that we understand what's out there and start to address those. Put a priority on those issues and start to address them. The first idea was to replace at least 1,000 linear feet of storm sewer and 6 inlets a year. It's kind of a baseline. You saw some of the examples that Steve showed you. There's a lot of infrastructure that needs some replacement. This kind of kickstarts us down that road. Locate and inspect all the BMPs in town. What are BMPs? Best management practices, right? So if you have a rain garden, you have a detention pond, you have practices on your land that actually control either the volume, the rate, or the quality of water. Those are best practices. The township owns some, and individual private owners own some. So, but the system requirement for Radnor is that they have to make sure all of those work. They're not just responsible for the township. Their permit says they also have to make sure those on private property are working. So we need to make sure we have an inventory of those and make sure they're all working properly. So if somebody upstream of you builds something and puts a best practice in place, it is getting maintained. There are maintenance agreements that go with those things. Permit compliance, that's just a requirement you have to do, is annually document your MS4 compliance. If you don't do that, unfortunately, EPA comes and slaps you on the wrist. It's just a requirement we have to do. And then provide additional education. I think that many communities over the years have been trying to do this by building on other things that are going on out there. So if there's a water resources meeting, people are showing up at that meeting and providing some information. But I think what Radnor's looking at now is delving deeper into that. What are the stormwater issues in your neighborhood? What do you need to know about it? What can you do that can make a difference? And so taking that to a higher level. And then finally, the program management piece. The asset management tools that are out there, and again, these are not real high-end technology, but they do allow you to start to think about your system on a GIS base. So it's a geographic system that locates all your facilities. You can track how often you maintain those facilities. You can track what the condition is, the age of those facilities. And it allows you to look at where you're spending all your energy and where your time's going, and start to prioritize things. These tools now are becoming very prevalent and not too expensive, but you do need somebody that knows how to use them and keep the information up to date. And then we're going to talk about a user fee and the importance of using tools like aerial photography. So we're going to show you that part of our program does have some money in there to do annual photography on a regular basis. So if we went for a user fee, you would have to expend that money. So all that said, what does that mean in terms of money? Okay, so if Radnor moved from spending about 1.1 million, which is their average, they do. In Steve's slide, there was some emergency money added to that. But on average, you spend about 1.1 million. That's your budget this year. This program would add another $2 million to what you're spending now, for a total of $3 million. So what we're talking about is how to fund that additional $2 million. So what are the options? Well, now you pay for the $1 million work that's going on through your real estate taxes. It's rolled up into your taxes, like road repairs and other things, right? So that's where the money's coming from. So raising taxes is an option. Finding some tax money from something else and moving it into stormwater is another option. And what's becoming more and more popular is something called a user fee. This is not all that different from what you do for paying for water or wastewater services. You pay based on what you use. So it's the same concept as having, this is a utility fee. Are there other things out there? There is some grant money, though limited these days, from the federal and state government. I think your community does a pretty good job of getting out there and trying to chase that, but it's not a lot there. Impact fees and specific things for developers can help a little bit, but they're really project specific. Public-private partnerships are something that you can need to explore a little bit more, looking for some, having a partner that will help you share some of these costs. Again, usually project-specific, but things like that. So when we're talking about the big user fee idea, these other things could come in and help you with that, but they won't fund your whole program. So I kind of just went through that, but this dedicated stormwater fee is just that. What you would have is collect money that would be dedicated to stormwater, and so we'd have an ordinance that would say it could only be used for certain stormwater programmatic issues. It couldn't be transferred when you need some money for something else in the township. Increase that real estate tax or utilize these funds, or a combination or others, or the do nothing option. You're spending $1 million a year, you're being reactive, you know what you're getting for your money. That's the alternative, is to stay where you are. So pros and cons in my mind of doing this. Pros, you do start to look at stormwater in a different way. It's more transparent. You look at the program of services that you need, and you distribute the public cost. So this is the cost that the township is going to bear at the public level. You distribute that across a wider variety of users, all right? So tax-exempt properties now are not paying basically into your stormwater fee because they're not paying taxes, and that's where your money comes from. This idea then spreads it out based on some reasonable measure of how everybody impacts the system, and we're going to talk a lot about impervious area as what the method that we're going to suggest you use. Fees are flexible. They can be adjusted every year based on the program of services you want to support. So they tie directly to that program of services. You can have credits for stormwater fees. So if somebody is doing something on their property that is avoiding public costs, so you've built a best practice that retains more water than the standards require. So if you're required to maintain the 1.5-inch storm and you do 2 inches, you get a credit for that, for doing more, doing something above and beyond. And then once in place, it's pretty easy to maintain. It gives you a pretty stable revenue source. This is done by the impervious area in your property, so there's not a lot of change every year. Property impervious area is like your meter, and so you're not doing meter reading every month. You're looking at it about once a year and maintaining a system that's pretty stable. Now, the hard part, the cons. This is a major change in public policy. Right? So we're talking about changing how you fund stormwater and raising money to make this a priority in your community. And you need political support, and so the community needs to understand what it is and whether they want to support this idea. It takes time. We've been working on this now for 10 months, I think, plus or minus. I actually worked with Gaylor in 2006. 2006, we started talking about this idea. We probably know that the recession hit, so that didn't kind of went away for a while. But the issue has not gone away. The need for funding something that seems to be growing in need here and priority. We would need to find a way to bill this, all right? So we're going to talk about billing the system. You have a good tax database that has all your parcel information in there. You can use that same system to send a bill for stormwater. And there are what I call perceived winners and losers with this approach. Those that are tax exempt don't often like the idea because they're being asked to pay more. And those that have a little bit of impervious, you typically don't mind paying something. Those with a lot of impervious area, big parking lots, things like that. This is a fee that's going to be substantial. So they might, rather that you do something around taxes than do this. So we have to take all that into consideration as we're having this discussion. So this is a pretty common approach. There's a report out from Western Kentucky University that's kind of been making the rounds, where they did a survey, and there's over 1,400 stormwater utilities reported in their survey. I would pick issue with a couple of those, but at least over 1,000 in the United States. And I just came back from Toronto. Oakville, Ontario is looking at the same approach, Mississauga, Ontario. The issues are not any different north of the border. But right here, local examples is Philadelphia's had a user fee in place now for about 15 years. Mount Lebanon passed theirs last year. They were a community about the same size as you out in western Pennsylvania. Meadville, Pennsylvania, another relatively small town. And then, south of here, Maryland, North Carolina, Florida. So this is not unique, but everybody's solution is a little bit unique. So we're going to talk a lot about distribution costs. When I think about a utility, this is a fee-based program that distributes those public costs using available data. All right, so in Radnor, you have data on your parcels, right? We know who owns what, and we have an impervious cover layer. That means we know rooftops and driveways and parts information on your property about how much impervious area there is. So we can use that information to see how we would distribute these costs. And I talk a lot about how stormwater fees are a lot like water and wastewater fees, and back in my earlier days, water bills, if you remember, were on your tax bill back in 70s and 80s, at least where I grew up in New England. You did not pay for that separately. It was rolled up into your taxes, and it was a 5 or 6 year process for most communities to take that out of the taxes and form a water authority or somebody that would actually charge a service fee. This is very similar because you don't pay a water fee based on the service at your individual home. Okay, so if you live a block from the water treatment plant, or you live 5 miles from the water treatment plant, so the cost for transportation, distribution, and energy to get the water to you is no different. If you use a gallon of water, the cost for that gallon of water is the same. So what you're paying for is the entire system. The whole public cost of distributing that water gets distributed evenly based on a gallon of water. So we take that same concept and try to apply it here. Is it perfect? Not all the time, but it's a pretty good one. Those that have less impervious area would pay less. Those that would have more impervious area would pay more. And why is that important? we hear a lot of people that say, well, I own 5 acres of land and I only have a house on it, so why are my impacts the same as everybody else's? When we look at impervious area, it's a cumulative effect, okay? So as soon as you go out and put something man-made impervious on your property, you've changed the hydraulics on that property. You start to increase runoff. The more you build, the more that increases. So impervious has been shown over and over again to really be related very much to what the amount of impervious, the amount of runoff will be for the whole community. This is an example, just if you can see this photo, of the data that we have that's in Radnor. This is a parcel, I don't know the actual address, but you can see the red area is all the impervious on this parcel. We cut out the part that is not impervious. There's some little grassy areas and some bushes and things like that on the property. So we can look at it pretty closely and tell you what's impervious on that parcel. So you have pretty good data that allows us to do this. The impervious cover model, this is an excerpt from the Center for Watershed Protection's report. They do a lot of work on how do we start to manage stormwater and when does it become really critical. And what they tell us is that the more impervious cover in a watershed, the more likely we're going to have water quality issues. We have erosion and sediment and pollution. And so we're trying to make sure that we minimize impervious area. And one of the indirect benefits of a impervious-based user fee is people will start thinking about putting impervious area down. They will use less because it will cost them less to do that. So it's a kind of an indirect incentive. So what do we do when we saw all that data? Our scope when we first looked at this was to figure out a way to charge residential properties kind of all the same thing. So we looked at the median amount of impervious data on all the residential single-family parcels. We did a sample. We didn't look at all of them. We sampled about 500 properties. And we said, what's the median amount of impervious? And you have a lot of impervious here. There's some very big parcels, a lot of people with 2- and 3-car driveways these days. So 3,460 square feet was the median amount of impervious on a single-family lot. All right, so talked a lot with the advisory committee, several members, and said, you know, we could charge all single families 1 billing unit. They're all charged the same because we don't want to have to go in and measure the impervious on all these single family properties, about 40,000 of them. So they said, well, can we find some other way to talk about impervious here that's Radnor specific, all right? Something that works for us, that would not be charging everybody. Those homes that only have 1,000 square feet of impervious, those that have 5,000, the same amount. Could we drill down a little bit on that information? So we did lots and lots of algorithms and stuff that you don't really care about, but the idea was we matched the impervious area to lot size for residential properties. And we found a pretty significant trend. I should have brought our numbers, but basically, if you're into the science of this, and I think Mike and some others maybe can do that for us, that as you have a larger lot here in Radnor, you have more impervious typically. So the trend line shows us that we could look at lot size and start to distribute the cost a little bit differently here in Radnor. So our recommendation is we look at your lot size. We've done the analysis on impervious and how it grows over time. And those with lots that are less than 7,000 square feet would be considered to have 1 billing unit. Okay, so as we talk about this, think about that as your meter reading. You know, I think for water, it's, you know, every 100 cubic feet. This would be 1 billing unit. Okay, for 1 billing unit for small lots, as your lots got bigger, your billing units will increase, up to a maximum of 4, depending on your lot size. Now, for non-residential properties, we're actually measuring that impervious. So that example I showed you that we measured all the non-residential properties and can tell you exactly how much impervious they have. So we would divide that number by 1,500 square feet. So every billing unit for a non-residential property, every 1,500 square feet would be 1 billing unit. Okay, so we have 1 billing unit for non-residential, 1,500 square feet, and for residential on the lot size. So about 46% of your properties are residential and 54 are non-residential. That total, about 25% of the billing units are actually for tax-exempt properties. So, okay, the answer to that puzzle. So we have a program of around $2 million a year. We have an idea of how to distribute those costs based on imperviousness across residential and non-residential property. What would it cost to fund the program the way we have it designed now? $3.05 a month or $36.60 per billing unit annually if we bonded. Okay, what does that mean? It means you would borrow money to pay for your capital. Bonds are relatively inexpensive at the moment, somewhere around 3 to 4%, but it does mean you would be using your credit card. You'd be borrowing over time to pay for this. The other option is to pay cash. All right, so pay as you go, pay what you can afford, and do it over time. And so that rate would be $4.72 a month per billing unit or $56.64 per billing unit. So if you are in one of those houses that's in unit 2, you know, most homes will be around 2 billing units, 2 to 3, just so you can kind of figure that out. So right now, what's in the ordinance that we've developed, the recommendation that's your board is looking at, has $56.64 to pay-as-you-go option. So what is that? How does this compare if you raise taxes, if you had to find the same amount of money on your tax rate? So we looked at your tax rate, and to raise $2 million, you need basically a rate that would go to 0.6345 mils. This is way too much information again, but think about your average residential property assessment that we just got from Delaware County is about $315,000, the average house in town. So that would be a tax increase of $200 if we use the same method, just trying to raise taxes straight up, that same approach we're using to user fee. So you can kind of see the difference between those two. So what did we get to at the end, and what do we really want to talk about today? The advisory committee, staff, and lots of folks like you that we've been talking to said we need to get started. We need to get started on something. We can't keep the storm system in the condition it's in, so let's get going. Let's keep the rate flat for a couple of years. Let's figure out what that is and keep it flat so we can plan and learn how to manage this. And start working on that list of capital projects. Now, the list of capital projects, and I have to put this disclaimer out there, nobody's endorsed this list. It is a working document. We know that you have about $10 million in needs that have been identified. They haven't all been vetted, and I think once you start doing inspections and getting out there ahead of the program, you're going to find more projects, not less. But we're thinking that you need to start spending at least $1 million a year on capital. Get several years of solid information, operation, capital work. Prove yourself, right? Get out there for the next couple of years, spend the money in the right places, do the right things, and see how this starts to work. Establish a credit program that is not, the details of that have not been worked out. The recommendation at the time is to get this up and running, and over the next 6 to 8 months, go back and have a focus group, an advisory committee that would work out the details of what that credit program would look like. And then another recommendation is that you need to have some kind of oversight committee for this. All right, so who's going to look, who's going to be the kind of overseers of how this is going to be set up every year, how it's operating. Other communities do report cards back to the public, things like that. So that's what one of the final recommendations. So there is a draft ordinance that's been posted on your website and that you can have access to, and it's really the legal framework for everything we're talking about. It would establish a dedicated user fee, we call it an enterprise fund. It would fund only stormwater projects, that list that we've kind of talked about, both in terms of operation and maintenance levels, regulatory compliance, capital projects. It has in it the rate structure, which is what we talked about, how single families would be billed and how non-residential properties would be billed. It sets the fee at the moment at $56, and it talks about how you would bill this and how collections would be there, and it says it will do a credit policy at some point. So that's in the ordinance that's out there. We did a session a couple of weeks ago. We've been tweaking the language to make it be more comprehensive, so I think that's probably some of the comments we'll continue to get. And that is up for consideration, and I don't know exactly, September 23rd will be the next Board of Commissioners meeting that we'll be discussing that. So this is an education session. This is to get you to answer lots of questions that you have about what we're doing, and then there will be a more formal public hearing to really talk more about this and make public comment. So, ask away. Here's Steve. He's going to answer all yours.
We're open now for your questions. And Barb's got a microphone. We're being televised, and so we'll need to, if you raise your hand, if you have a question, she'll come to you. And if you would, please give us your name and your address.
Clara Forsora at 808 Colony Road, Bryn Mawr. So I was just curious, a couple of questions. With your impervious cover discussion, what changes have been proposed regarding your existing zoning ordinances to reduce impervious cover?
The zoning ordinances that we have currently stay the same as they are right now. But what this ordinance, the proposed ordinance, would do would give us the ability to go in and to change your ordinance and to fully review your ordinance takes time and it takes money. And one of the projects that could come out of this is amendments to the zoning ordinance as well as amendments to the stormwater management policy that we have. So although they're not directly connected, very easily can become part of that program which Jean mentioned, which is very fluid. And there was a list of projects made, not vetted, not prioritized necessarily, but we know there's items that need to be done, and this is part of it. And if you go back to the items I put as what's needed for stormwater management, land use planning was one of them.
Yeah, it seems like you should stem the issue of more impervious coverage. When you did your analysis regarding lot size and impervious coverage and the aligned ratio between the two, were you analyzing the actual numbers or the relationship between the lot size?
We first looked at the actual numbers, and so what we did is we took that sample size that we had, about 500 properties, and took actual numbers for those and looked at several things that we tried to get them to relate to, one being lot size. And put them into, well, we did a median then for each of those groups. So 0 to 7,000, we looked at the median in that group, and then we looked at the relationship to that next group and tried to find something that made sense so that and we're really trying to work towards the lower end is about 15 to 16% of the properties, but 67% in the middle, and then the other portion. So we're trying to do a bell curve, and that's where that that breakdown came down. It also works pretty well with how you zone now, because most of your properties are based on land use, and it fits in nicely. So most people have a really good sense of which of those you fall into, which was another part of it.
I think it'd just be interesting to know the relative relationship. You could have,
I think we'd give you, you can.
it may be the same, I don't know, but you could have a
pretty-
small property owner who chooses to, if your zoning permits it, which goes back to my first point, permits them to build out 60% of their lot.
Right.
You could then have a larger property owner who chooses to build out their lot in a different way, who actually has less impervious coverage in total. And their rate, what they've done is made the choice that you want them to make, which your stated objective was less impervious coverage. So
Yeah.
I would just challenge your data, or I'd like to see additional data supporting that.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's talked about a lot is, can we get better data going forward? And we had in the program that in year 3 they would do new aerials and do the impervious on all the single families. So you would be billed just like everybody else. If you had 500 square feet or 1,000, you could adjust that. Data's not there right now, but that's the point. I think if you want to make it as equitable as you can, you need to get that additional data. And I think we've talked about moving that up in the program to getting that done in the first year. It's somewhere in the $30,000 to $50,000 range. So getting that, and it takes about 6 to 8 months to get done.
I actually would like to compliment you. I thought this presentation was certainly very informative, and it does create a very compelling need to address stormwater. So I thank you for that. But I also then raises a very huge question in my mind, and that is what has been happening to our tax dollars already. Because if this is such a large issue, which apparently and logically would be, I'm kind of wondering what's happening to our tax dollars. I'm standing in a gorgeous building, which is nicer than Lower Merion Township. It's nicer than Newtown Township. It's nicer than the executive office of the General Electric CEO. So I have to ask myself, what is happening with our taxes? And I don't disagree with you. I think the stormwater management is critical. It needs to be addressed. But I do now, you've opened a different can of worms in my mind about now investigating what is done with our budget, how it's spent, and the choices that have been made.
Unfortunately, I don't think either one of our panelists can address that.
I know they're not in the position. They're trying to get the right thing done for stormwater management.
Yes.
But since this is on the record and there are other taxpayers here, I feel it's important to mention that I think we all need to pay attention to what our leaders in the township are choosing to do with the rather high taxes we currently are paying.
All right, thank you. Do we have another question?
Like to add, as an aside to that, our budget process is a very transparent process. If you go on our website under the Finance tab, you will find probably more than you would ever want to read about on our budget. Our Finance Director, Mr. Bill White, does a fantastic job. So there's quite a bit of information on there.
I have several questions. First one is, has anybody ever thought of a fee for setbacks, and when it comes in front of an appeal for the township, that like the real estate tax, that there is a fee? Because we know it's going to cause more runoff. And that then when you do the footage thing later, you still get that fee. In other words, you're double dipping at them, right? But because you know it's going to cause a problem down the road. Why wouldn't you go ahead with the townhouses and the density approval thing, put a condition, which indeed was put on me, of continued maintenance on that the townhouses have to do. I can tell you from an experience, I lived down off Bryn Mawr Avenue, and when the Proclamation Presbyterian Church came in, the township thought it'd be really great if after they piped the water down to my stream, that I maintained the head wall that they were going to dump on my property. And I went in front of this township and the state and had an agreement that the Proclamation Presbyterian Church had to take care of their own water and maintain it. And that is here, that record is here in the township. And on many occasions, it was not being taken care of.
Can they answer that question first before they?
Okay.
In 2005, the Radnor Township adopted its current stormwater management ordinance. And as part of that ordinance, there is not only a requirement to install a best management practice, a physical device for stormwater management, there's also a maintenance requirement and a maintenance agreement. Prior to that, I don't believe that was enforced. And this is very standard stuff because around that time, all the municipalities were required to adopt these stormwater management ordinances based on watersheds. And there's specifics to each watershed in those ordinances. But today, we do require that. And in our planning and in our engineering reviews of projects, those are the things we look at. Where do things discharge to? Who's responsible for them? Was an easement obtained to go on somebody's property? And I don't know when that occurred, but I'd like to say I don't see issues of that type moving forward. Every development is going to have to discharge their stormwater, but the manner in which it's done and where it's done is more regulated since at least 2005.
Would you identify yourself too?
My name is Betsy Slattery. Excuse me for not saying that before. Another thing I wanted to say, I think the way you went after fees for footages and the rest of it, that there ought to be a published thing of credit for big woods and big trees on properties as an incentive, that's going to give you credit, but you're getting it published so that people realize it. And furthermore, I think we all know that the landscapers are very generous with sharing with neighbors, the blowing, and they do it majorly in stormwater culverts and the rest. My thought is that when they go ahead and pay to be an occupational person in the township, another fee is added to their thing. It doesn't have to be said that way, of $10 or $15, which goes into the maintenance of picking up their mistakes. Okay? Why does the township go after the large property owner? They require less services, i.e., schools compared to the apartments, less trash collection. They pay more in taxes and help maintain open space. And these are all important factors. And lastly, because I'm here and I don't go to all the meetings, Ardrossan, why are we buying floodplain? The Scots and Whalers must be thrilled to take the dollars for unbuildable land that no one wants to maintain. We ought to, and if we do have them go develop the rest of it, we know it's more schools, more other problems. And I don't think that that's a responsible thing. We need more playing fields. We need more other services. The township people pay the taxes, and it's not to be dumped in floodplain. So those are some ideas for you.
And do you guys want to answer what you can?
I'm not sure you asked a lot of questions there, but if I can just make a couple of comments. the idea of publishing something around, rewarding people for trees and open space, and I think that's part of the conversation that's going to happen around credits. What do you want to reward people for? Buffer zones, things like that. I think infiltration areas, that all has to be under consideration. Putting land aside in conservation easements, things like that is an important piece of that puzzle, and I think that conversation is going to happen over the next couple of months.
Every time an appeal comes up, we all know that causes more runoff.
I think the more impervious that goes out there, the more runoff we have. And I think, now, presuming that this isn't an approach that gets adopted, that's going to be a disincentive for people to keep paving everything, right? So having a disincentive to pave because you want to pay as much, and then an incentive to keep green space, that's part of kind of the indirect benefits of doing this. And on the last part, on the floodplain part, I think you said, what we need is some more open space to store stormwater. One of the big problems locally is that we've built on too many places that we didn't need to build on. So making those decisions about land use, we talked about, Steve talked about how do you decide about land use. The natural floodplain has got to be protected so that the water can go there. It's where it's supposed to go. And then we do better planning around planning in those other areas where we can better manage it. And I think, that's just a key planning piece that we need to work through from a zoning and planning piece. Don't let more people build in the floodplain. And if it's an open field or it's something like that, I lived a long time in Greensboro, North Carolina, and they dedicated all their 100 feet on either side of every stream, and they put children's parks there and things like that because rain could come in and flood it, but it wasn't doing disastrous damage. They could repair them pretty quickly. So what do you put in those places? So all good comments. I think you understand stormwater as well as I do.
Just on the credit item, the Board of Commissioners made it clear in no uncertain terms that a credit policy, if it's as part of this proposed draft ordinance, will be back to the board within 6 months of adoption. So that would be fast track to have a credit policy.
I also would like not to corner the meeting.
Excuse me, ma'am, could we see if there are any other questions, and then we'll come back to you.
I do, but I would prefer that she finish her line of thought, and I won't get cut in the middle of mine. Are there other people from that?
There's someone back there.
Hi, my name is Darla DeMauro, and I live at 307 Windsor Avenue behind the Wawa off of Route 30. And you mentioned a couple of times that the list that you're maintaining right now does have concerns that are to be addressed or are currently being addressed. I wasn't clear on how that's happening right now. Where I live, the area, the street right next to Wawa, which is Banbury, floods every single time it rains with any amount at this point. So I'd like to just learn a little bit more about the priority list. And as you've stated several times, what you've shared with us today is in draft form. I have no doubt that we will move forward at some level on this project. But how are we addressing current health and safety issues out there, like these drains that are not clearing for hours and in fact are flooding out large parcels of property? I'm sure my area isn't the only one, but it is in fact getting more and more dangerous in the 6 years that I've lived here. Thank you.
You bring up a great point, and that is definitely Banbury Francis right there. That's been going on for many years. Similar to other places in the township, Eagle and North Wayne and, Poplar, there's a lot of those different areas. The list was made, I'm going to say probably a year ago, and it is a very fluid list. And the group, staff, the SAC members, we talked about this list, we put this list together, but it is by no means at this point a true roadmap, because until funding becomes available and then we can go in and bring things to our Board of Commissioners, publicly vet the projects. If you may know, if you've watched meetings in the past, we don't just Public Works and Engineering, which I'm responsible for, we don't just pick projects and say, hey, this is one we want to do. There's a whole process in coming to this board and going through the Board of Commissioners to see if they approve. And we've talked about having an oversight committee, and whether they have input into what projects are done or perhaps how money is spent. But that's definitely an area that's problematic. There is actually, some years ago, there was a stormwater management system installed under Francis. It can't handle all that water, and we know that. We have other systems like that. That is definitely one of the areas we would want to look at. Could I tell you that that's year 1, year 4, year 8? I don't know. You know, once we start to go through this and we come up with a list, that's where we go to our board. And we have a highly educated board, and everybody has specific questions as to why you want to do a project and what's the return on that project, how many people does it affect. So are areas like that things we want to address? Absolutely. Could at this point in time I tell you that that would happen at a certain time? No, I couldn't. The ultimate process, the end of the process, is going to the Board of Commissioners with projects or a project, bringing that forth at a public meeting. Those meetings are advertised, our agendas are posted and advertised, and giving the public and staff a chance to say, here's a project we wish to do, here's why we wish to do it, and the public has the opportunity to comment on it, and the board has all their time to ask whatever questions, perhaps even continue to another meeting. And the typical questions are, what does the project cost? Who will it affect? How many people will it affect? What is it in comparison to another project that may be out there?
I'll try to answer her question. We're meeting with you tomorrow, Mrs. No. I'm sorry, Jim Higgins, Commissioner for the First Ward. So Steve and I are going to meet with you tomorrow. And to answer your question, how does the project get on the list? Well, the Board of Commissioners makes up the list. But the Board of Commissioners will be influenced by the needs of a particular area of the township. And I know I've spent a lot of time in other areas of the First Ward on issues, and I have not spent much time at all on your area, and I'm sorry that I haven't, but I can assure you from here on I will be. And I am aware that the intersection of Banbury and Francis is a chronically bad area from the standpoint of drainage. And as Steve said, we do have an underground system there, but it's apparently way under capacity. And I think, Steve, you indicated to me in an email that it's scheduled for maintenance in the very near future. So that ought to help a little bit. But again, I'd like to assure you that this will become a priority for me personally, and I hope I can convince the other 6 commissioners, or 3 of them anyway, majority rules, to put this close to the top of the list.
Could add to Commissioner Higgins, and all along, all through our Stormwater Advisory Committee meetings and to the board, we've always made it very clear, you know, the final decision is made by the Board of Commissioners. So, and they have the control on that list, as Commissioner Higgins said. So it is not a staff decision, it's not a consultant decision. It's always going to go to our elected officials. They have the authority and the ability to enact which projects move and when.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Maya Van Rossum, the Delaware Riverkeeper, and I'm also a resident of Radnor Township. And I first would like to begin by thanking you very, very much. I'd like to really personally thank Steve Norsini and Commissioner Elaine Paul Schaefer for making sure that the comments that have been brought forth to date are genuinely being considered and resulting in modifications to the ordinance proposal. It was suggested at the original Board of Commissioners meeting by some of the commissioners that there was no openness to changes, and so I really do thank the 2 of you for ensuring that openness, because that's what the public process is all about. I have a preliminary question. I actually went on after the Monday night Board of Commissioners meeting. I had gotten a copy of the ordinance that was posted before the meeting. And then I heard some conversation at the meeting, and when I looked at the copy I had, things were said at the meeting that didn't seem to be represented in the version that was posted before the meeting, and I couldn't find the version posted after the meeting, and now there's a version out there. So I don't actually know what I read.
That was by design, Mike. No, I'm just kidding. Now, we actually emailed this. I emailed your assistant this morning because
Okay.
our emails never go through.
Yes.
So we had a draft ordinance for the last meeting on Monday. At that meeting, so that's what was posted prior to the meeting. At that meeting, Commissioner Jim Higgins had noted that he had made some edits that was not put forth at that time. Commissioner Schaefer, Nagel, and everybody had input into that, and that's where, Commissioner Schaefer had said this needs to move up to 6 months for the credit program. So there's a lot of different items that were talked
Okay.
about, and what you have outside may be some of that. What you will see posted before the next meeting on where this is on the agenda will be, the edits by Commissioner Higgins, the other commissioners, and staff requests that things get on. So you're not looking at, I guess, the final version of
Okay.
what will go on. There's some small items in there that have to be changed, some commas, as well as some larger things. I think we've tried to incorporate a lot of what you brought forth, and a lot of the terms were changed from storm sewer system to the stormwater management system, and BMPs are noted. We're going to continue and note, we'll reference the BMP manual. We'll reference structural and non-structural BMPs, and I want to thank you for the input you had, because I think it did really open it up. I mean, I think in its previous form it worked, but I think with what a lot of the suggestions you've had and what the board's had, it's made it a little easier to read, and I think it is more encompassing to the use of alternative methods and different methods of stormwater management. So I thank you for that. And there will be another version that goes on. Jennifer DiStefano usually posts that, that's done later in the week before, and that will have all the comments that were noted prior.
Okay, all right, so given that, I'm going to ask some questions and or say some things, and then you might tell me, don't worry, Maya, it's coming, right? So you already confirmed that the BMP manual that was commented on is actually going to be put in the language.
It
Yeah.
will reference the BMP manual.
Okay. And is the advisory committee going to be use shall language rather than may language? The version I have says may, but I thought at the commissioners meeting when I watched the video it said shall? Or should I wait to see the final?
I would ask you to wait to see the final on that.
Then what I am...
mean,
okay.
that's totally at the board's pleasure, how they wish to form that committee, if they wish to form that committee, and how that could be.
Okay, I just thought it was, okay, I'll wait to see it. One thing I do really want to point out to you, which I didn't hear commented on and needs to be remedied, is you have defined the term stormwater management costs. So unless I'm really having trouble with my reading, I actually didn't see that term used anywhere in the document other than being defined. So I would encourage you to go back and look, because if you defined it, you clearly intended to use it for some reason, and it's a very significant definition. So I'd ask you to go back and please figure out where you intended to use it, or get rid of it, right? Because it's not necessary. It's very difficult not having the final language. Well, on the commissioners' meeting Monday night, is that going to be a comment or is that going to be a vote? Because I understood that it was going to be a vote, but if we don't have the final, I really want to comment at a meaningful time so changes could be brought forth before the meeting, when really, if they're going to vote on Monday night, it's too late to say anything Monday night.
It's never too late to say anything. I mean, no, truthfully, because this has been the process, and you've been involved in this process, has been going on for a year, and the commissioners have had this scheduled for several meetings. The ordinance has been out there. The meeting that this will be on, it would be scheduled for a vote, but that does not mean there can't be input. That does not mean you cannot email your commissioner, your ward commissioner, or the manager, myself, the stormwater@radnor.org, and we can take a look at those, and we'll always reply. And again, we've incorporated quite a bit of what you had noted in there. And it's at the board's discretion if that version should change or not, but your comments are always welcome. And I would suggest that you
Well-
provide comments shortly, and you can email them to the board or myself, and they can be looked at, well prior to the meeting.
Okay, what I'd like to do is provide some comments now.
Sure.
But I recognize that I don't have the current version, so you may say to me. But based on the version that I have, I am still concerned that there is not enough good language in there about avoiding runoff, about, for example, purchasing of floodplains, restoring floodplains, or purchasing or restoring a parcel of land because it's having a direct impact in terms of the volume of runoff it's dumping on somebody downstream, right? So that's a very important stormwater best management practice. I also continue to be concerned that the language doesn't allow you to address flood damages which contribute to additional flood damages. For example, if you have a stream that's eroding away public or private lands, not only are you eating away those public and private lands as a result of an increased volume and velocity of runoff, but that means that you're also shooting that runoff at a greater velocity and a greater volume on some downstream neighbor. Whereas if you, through natural channel design, address that erosion problem, did some a vegetated buffer, you would not only be solving the problem of the particular property owner, public or private, but you would also be helping those immediately downstream. So some language that allows you to address flood damages, recognizing that as you address the flood damages, you're responding to the harm that has been created, but also protecting those who live downstream. I think, there are some pretty easy ways to make these fixes. If you go into your definition of stormwater management system and you include that it's the system for stormwater collection, conveyance, and avoidance, right? That allows you to get at some of those best management practices that deal with avoidance, not just infiltration, but removal of impervious surface, revegetation, as the one woman talked about. You talk in your stormwater management system about channels. It's not clear to me whether you mean man-made channels or stream channels, so I would suggest that you add to that stream channels and lands.
Could I comment on a couple of them?
Sure.
And I know you have a very good background in this, and one of the things in the ordinance is we want to be specific enough to be able to allow the township latitude to do certain projects, but also when we get too very, very specific, you get to the point where you are limited to the 20 items you listed. So in some cases, we tried to be open. So in channels, it's just that, it's channels. It's man-made channels, it's natural channels. My recommendation, and believe me, it's only a recommendation from my point, is to leave portions of the ordinance open enough for interpretation by the board and the public that these projects can be done and, legally and upfront. But if we get so very, very specific, you almost get to the point of where you exclude projects. So my recommendation to you and everyone would be, we need to put some of that language in. I think a lot of it's covered in when we just say the PABMP Stormwater Manual, because a lot of what you're talking about is in there. So although we're not going to list everything, we're saying, hey, refer to the manual. Referring to the manual then brings up a lot of these. So I think it's a fine line on some of them.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, but as an attorney, the one thing that I know is when you do start creating long lists, when you exclude the opportunity for things, because by virtue of the fact that you've created a long list, you actually end up excluding things if you don't in some way articulate them. And that's the problem here, is you have a very long list of identified terms. And all of those terms tend to, not all, a lot of those terms tend to relate to the man-made structures. So that's why, in my capacity as a licensed attorney, that's why I see the need for that additional language there, because you do have such a long list already. I appreciate the need. There are some changes that you've made to the definition of impervious surface, which I see as being able to get to some of my issues of concern through the additional implementation process. And so, I'm good with that, right? But there is a little bit of I hear you, I agree with you, and that's in fact why I'm suggesting some of these changes. And then the only other thing is, in terms of the use of the Stormwater Management Fund, I think the way to get to some of what I'm talking about is if you allow the use of the Stormwater Management Fund for the purposes of the stormwater management system, as you've defined it, but you also allow it to be used in two other ways. Okay, so the change, there are a couple ways to accomplish my goals, and this would be another way, my goals, the township goals. One would be that after you talk about the use of the fund for the stormwater management system, comma, all related capital costs, you add two additional items. One is, comma, to address stormwater damages, in the way I talked about it, because in so doing, you address additional stormwater problems, flood damages and the like, and then to and/or strategies designed to prevent, avoid, or minimize an existing volume of stormwater runoff that otherwise is creating a stress on the system. And the reason why I use existing stormwater runoff, right, is we don't want to be talking about doing this for new development, because new development should be getting addressed through our zoning ordinances. But to the extent that we have an existing problem and we're trying to go back and fix it, and using the word strategies does allow you to go back to all those good approaches that are identified in the BMP manual, because if you identify the BMP manual and the whereas clauses and the findings of fact, they are not the substantive implementation provisions of this document. So it depends where you put that reference to the BMP manual. So anyway, so those, I will write this down and give it in comment, but I did want to provide those. Again, I think that you've made a lot of really important good changes, and I'm very grateful to you for doing that. I just think that it is not true that if we implement this, we can come back and fix it in a year or two. We all know reality of politics. That's not happening. So let's just get it right from the get-go, and with some additional modifications, I think we can do that. So thank you.
If I could, if you send that electronically, and the
I'll do it through Deb.
implementations that we did were through the board. I mean, that we were directed by the board to do so, so that you should thank the Board of Commissioners on that. And yeah, don't you send the email, because nobody gets your emails.
I know.
You have to, somebody in your office has to send it. And then we have the ability to use some of that. That'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Wolf from the 2nd Ward. I served on the Stakeholders Advisory Committee loyally through many months. Since the Stakeholders Advisory Committee has ceased to meet, the ordinance and the stormwater plans have been discussed by the board. A couple of the board members are toying with the idea of improving the system by dividing the township into 2 or more watersheds, and then sort of lockboxing the revenues by watershed and trying to spend the money that's collected on a watershed by watershed basis in the attempt to be fair. I personally am nervous about that. I'm afraid that, for example, if the commissioners had a high priority to accelerate Banbury Road and the monies collected in that watershed hadn't yet grown to be sufficient, that would impede their ability to prioritize projects. And I want the commissioners to have the full discretion of putting the projects in order as they come, even if the money from that subunit lags. Turns out I'm a little late. This may not be an active consideration anymore. So, as Emily Latella was heard to say many times, never mind.
Good point. The township building, the more they take care of it.
That's great.
Just a little out of date.
Sorry, do we have some other questions?
My name is Kathy Shaw. I live in 702 Knox Road in Villanova. I would just like to say that I don't like the idea that the Board of Commissioners are going to vote on this in what I think is a really rush kind of way. I mean, I know this has been going on, but at the same time, I think that there are enough people here to show that we have questions. And to say they're going to vote on this and make it a done deal on Monday, I don't think that's right.
The meeting for this is actually the 23rd, and please don't think it's a done deal, but literally every property owner in the township received a mailer, where we advertise dates. It's been great with the League of Women Voters. This is the second meeting. I'm going to say I think the ordinance was on the agenda for 4 prior meetings. So, this has been just the ordinance has been discussed for the bulk of the summer, up until what we've had there. And we do have our email, stormwater@radnor.org, to send your comments to, and we compile them for the board, myself, or to your board members. So if you do have questions, now is the time. It's not too late. Now is definitely the time to get them in to your elected officials so they can see what your concerns may be. And now is also a perfect forum if you wish to discuss them today, if you have any questions up front.
I'm going to say that that's ridiculous.
Hang on, Betsy. We're got another question. Get a question back here, and then we'll get to.
Hi, my name is Kathleen Papa. I live in St. David's, and I've lived here for over 20 years, and I am just curious because since the moment I moved into this township, I have heard all about stormwater management, especially regarding the middle school. So I am curious what has happened in the past with all of the monies allowed for the stormwater management, and I'm just also very curious. I know that any impervious surface, I've lived here, as I said, long enough to know that any impervious surface, anything you want to do in your home, your house, you have to come and get a permit or be in front of some board of some sort. So the impervious surface has been approved, and I feel that there's a lack of foresight over the past 20 years. What is going to be put in place to prevent that in the future? I also am curious about if this fee will increase, because I do believe, as you had stated earlier in your presentation, that we only have probably a small percentage of the needs identified. And I assume that I'm assuming the implication there is that as the mapping, et cetera, goes on, more needs will be identified. I have not heard any, and I did watch the meeting on Monday, but I have not heard anything about the cap of a fee. Could this possibly go? Now, maybe it's something for the commissioners, but could this increase? I hear about maybe I think it was $29 to $56, but I've never heard a top off. I assume, like everything else in the world, that will go up, but I really would like that to be addressed. And then one more question. The mapping. There are no current records of where these stormwater runoff and the events are all throughout the township? For the past 60, 70 years? Is there any overlying map?
There is, as part of the MS4 program, the Municipal Separate Storm Sewer Program, which was instituted a few years back, mapping was one of the first requirements. So there is mapping done of the township storm sewer system. Is it the entire system? By no means. In the 60s, 70s, 80s, and on, we have subdivision plans that we can use to help locate these things. But when you go to the older parts of town, there are no blueprints for that. So you'll see an inlet in the street, and in that case, we're trying to find it to where it goes. And just to touch on the impervious surface, currently under regulation, if you were going to put an addition on your house, as part of that process, you would get a grading permit. And in that grading permit, there's required stormwater management based upon the size of the new impervious. So it goes up to 500 feet, and then there's a different bracket when you're 5 to 15, and then so on. So, and this all came about, a lot of this with the 2005 Stormwater Ordinance, which was saying, okay, there was a lot of homes built many years ago, and the technology and the engineering thought at the time didn't address it. But moving forward, we're going to make those incremental changes. So you're not doing stormwater management for your whole house, but you did have to do it for the addition that you put on. So there was some foresight there moving forward on that. And that is part of our ordinance. It has been for some time.
Just one more question.
correct. Stating that's for our Board of Commissioners. No, I said that is a question you would have to address to the Board of Commissioners.
I'm just curious, if you don't mind following up on it, Steve, on something you said, that a few years ago there was some stormwater management, something on Francis Avenue in Banbury. I think you had said there was a line put in some years ago. What has happened? Why wasn't that adequate if it continues to flood?
There is an underground stormwater system that was put in, and when I say years ago, I think that may have been 20 years ago, 18 years ago. And like some of the other systems that you'll see around town, the systems were designed for certain frequency storms. So they weren't designed to take all the storms that come through. And as we know, we get some pretty severe storms much more frequently. You know, it's not anecdotal. There is evidence to show that we get higher frequency storms that are more common. So that system that was installed, now I can't answer for the designer of 15 years ago or the thought of 15 years ago, but their thought may have been, we're going to do something for X storm. It does not handle all the other storms. So when we get these bigger storms, it's not effective. That's no different than when you would see, maybe if you see inlets on your street and you live in an older part of town and the road starts to pond heavily, those pipes can't handle it. Oh, absolutely. That's what all this is about, and that's one of the reasons I'm here and this whole program's here.
And 18 or 20 years ago is a while back, and storm frequency has changed. Maybe it's the frequency aspect, but doesn't the township have like stormwater review for up to 100-year storms and the requirements in your zoning for that? Like the massive storms that hit every so often? And isn't that accommodated in your plans for stormwater management?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure the question you're asking.
Okay, the question is related to your point on, you got me, okay.
Right, there are design standards in our stormwater management ordinance. That's from 2005 on, and there's actually charts and pages that'll tell you, here's the design frequency storm, here's what you have to design
It's
for.
just more recent.
Right, and it's not that what happened in the 60s was bad. It was different. It wasn't thought. Their thought was get this water off the streets as quickly as possible, and they did, and they piped it to creeks or through big basins that may or not have been effective. The engineering standard of the time has changed, and it's changed since 2005, and we hope to implement some of that.
I just, to add to that point, I think we also have to really recognize two things. One, if you live along a creek, flooding is a normal, natural, needed part of the creek's life cycle. It's why the creek stays a creek and doesn't become a swamp or a wetlands and then static land. So we don't want to stop flooding. We want to stop avoidable flood damages. And I think the other thing that we have to really recognize is storms are getting bigger. They are getting more frequent. When they fall, how they fall, where they fall, how much they fall has a big impact. And a lot of that you can't design for. The 100-year storm events are going to flood. And that, that's part of nature. And that's why part of the strategy has to be about ensuring that we are building in places or through voluntary programs, removing existing building in places where we know there will flood no matter what you do. I mean, that's part of our reality, and that's why that element of your program, avoidance of runoff, but also addressing damage, including damage to structures, is so vitally important, and why protection of a parcel like Ardrossan is vitally important. Not only is Ardrossan an important part of the flood avoiding flood damages for downstream communities, but the reality is you can build in floodplains. The regulations don't prevent you from building in floodplains. They tell you how to build in floodplains. And as soon as you put a structure and you remove trees and you put in grass, you increase the volume of runoff that gets dumped on your downstream neighbors. So those kinds of programs and use of our public funds are vitally important as part of our stormwater strategy, and playing fields increase runoff.
Any other questions? Oh, Betsy.
I'm going to say that one thing about the streams, it's a liability for a homeowner to have a stream on their property. And I'm going to say that my family gave Castleton Lane to the township. They also gave the easement for a sewer line. I can tell you the number of times that the sewer overflowed on my property, and it was really exciting, like on a Christmas morning, to come down and not be able to get a hold of anybody in the township, where all the Radwin sewer was on my property, okay? Very exciting. The other thing is that a good many of these sewer systems in Radnor Township run right along the stream, and they leak big time. They're just cement pipes, and that's all going in the stream. So you might as well be aware that that water is anything but clean. It's just part of the cesspool that you have within the township. And I can tell you, when we built Castleton Lane, we very nicely gave an outlet at the end of Castleton Lane and Bryn Mawr Avenue. And as a committee woman, I went in front of the township numerous times asking that maybe we didn't have to take all the water that went from the Bryn Mawr Hospital all the way down to our stream and have it with one cul-de-sac, that maybe something else like the state or one of the other properties along the way could go ahead and take some of the burden. And this goes on over and over again in this township. And the commissioners that sit up here in this Taj Mahal don't worry about what's going on like in the 5th Ward or some of these other areas within the township. And I think that they are quick to pass these rules because it doesn't affect them in their little neighborhood. Okay? Enough said on that one.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other final questions? Well, again, I thank everybody for coming out on this lovely hot day in September. We actually are going to be holding another forum tonight at 7 o'clock. You're going to hear basically the same messages from our participants, but you're welcome to attend or invite your friends to attend. And again, on behalf of the League of Women Voters, I thank you for coming.